The quarter life crisis is so different because it happens so much earlier, right? It happens in our 20s. But what people don't realize is that there are equally so many of those existential questions at this age. Feeling the pressure in this generation, right? Like previously, you kind of had a bit of a blueprint for what you were meant to be doing in your 20s. This idea that when you have too many choices, it actually doesn't provide you with the more freedom as we would think. It actually makes you more confused, and it creates this like decision fatigue and this overload. There is always going to be a choice inherent within that, and you really have to like sit back and think about your values.
The idea of the quarter life crisis, I think, is kind of what undergirds your work for the psychology of the 20s, and it's kind of a play, obviously, on the midlife crisis. So maybe you could begin by telling us how the quarter life crisis is different, what kind of problems you think define it, and so on.
I want to say Ollie kind of just like opened my eyes. I'm like, yeah, the whole basis of my work is the quarter life crisis, but I had never really thought about that. You're totally spot on. I think the big difference is obviously quarter versus mid. We're so used to this like typical idea of a midlife crisis where it's a fancy red sports car, it's an ear piercing, it's like a young wife, or like just like a divorce. Like you just have this major turning point. And I think it really comes from this like existential sense of like, I've been living my life one way for so long. What am I going to do with this next half of my life? But the quarter life crisis is so different because it happens so much earlier, right? It happens in our 20s. But what people don't realize is that there are equally so many of those existential questions at this age, and they feel so important because there is so much emphasis and pressure placed on this like period of our lives, right? So the questions often revolve around like, what do I actually want to do with my life? What actually makes me happy? Who do I want to be? What kind of relationship do I want to have with myself, with others? Like, it's just this period of confusion, but it's also this period of transition, much like the midlife crisis, where we're kind of entering into this new phase and we're halfway stuck in the old phase, halfway panicked by how far ahead we should be in the next phase. That's where like the crisis that's the crisis point right there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the midlife crisis is like such a cliche, but then the quarter life crisis is only just a play on it, which kind of suggests it's more of a new thing. Why do you think the quarter life crisis is new, whereas the midlife crisis is something that's, you know, kind of almost overplayed?
Oh my gosh, it's such a great question. I honestly don't know, but I do think that it's because we're kind of feeling the pressure in this generation, right? Like previously, you kind of had a bit of a blueprint for what you were meant to be doing in your 20s, right? Like it was very stereotypical. It was very traditional. It was, you know, maybe go to uni, get a trade, finish high school, do something educational, skill-based, then get married, start a family. And there were these certain like economic goals that weren't as difficult to kind of hit, right? Like buy a house or like get your parents to help you buy a house, like pop out a few kids. And it was very structured. And it's such a blessing that obviously some of those structures that's not the only choice that we have anymore. Right? There's so much more freedom and inclusion, but it also means that you're kind of left to really forge your own path. And have you guys come across this term? I'm sure you have, called choice overload.
Not actually. Could you explain that?
I'm going to explain it, and I think that you'll be like, oh yeah, I totally know what you're talking about. So it's basically this idea that when you have too many choices, it actually doesn't provide you with the more freedom as we would think. It actually makes you more confused, and it creates this like decision fatigue and this overload of like, okay, previously, you know, if I had to choose between an apple and a pear, there's like a 50% chance that I'm going to make the right choice. Even if I'm completely torn, I'm still going to enjoy one of these. Okay, then I want you to choose from like every single fruit and vegetable that exists in the world at the supermarket, and you can only pick one. And it's kind of like, well, I've just got so many more pro cons to add up, and it's going to take me a lot longer. And a lot of the time people are less satisfied with the decision because they're like, well, look, I'm constantly comparing to this other fruit that I could have had. That is what life is like nowadays. Yes, there are no longer just two options. There's millions, unlimited options, but actually that makes us feel even more restricted because there's more pressure to choose the right one and there's more comparison between them. And I think that also really contributes to this newer idea of the quarter life crisis for sure. And I'm sure you guys have probably experienced choice overload. Like normally I tell people about it and they're like, hell yeah, totally.
Yeah, I just graduated from Oxford, so Ollie's still got a year left. But I just graduated and it felt not only a choice overload in terms of what I wanted to do as a job, but also in terms of which country I wanted to live in, right? So I'm like, do I want to move to London? Do I want to go back home to my family in Malta? So I think, especially with globalization, there's just so much choice that it becomes hard to know, as you said, what the right thing is.
Globalization is a huge one, right? And it's so funny because you normally don't talk about that in psychology, but it is the sense of like, there's just this huge dispersion and there's just this huge expansion of possibility that is great, but also can be super, super like overwhelming to decide what you want to do.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's a bad thing to be lost in this day and age, or do you think it can actually be like a learning experience?
I think it ends up being a learning experience, but like in the moment it feels terrible. Like so many things. It's like heartbreak, right? Like in the moment it absolutely sucks, but then like give it a year and you're like, nah, that totally needed to happen. Hindsight is like the most beautiful thing in the world. She like makes everything clear. And I think that's the same with being lost. Like in the moment, it's like, this just sucks. I want to know what's happening. I want to know where I'm going. I want to know who I am. It's like all in time, because if you knew who you were right now, if you knew exactly where you were going, who you were going to be with, who you were going to be full stop, where you were going to live, like it's not exciting. It's not exciting and it's not much fun. And so you kind of just have to lean into like what you said, Lucas, like sometimes the benefits of that discovery period, because it's like not everyone has that option as well. I think that makes it also so much important to focus on. Like it's a beautiful thing to have so much choice that you feel lost within it.
Want your head and hair to feel cool and clean? Been going to extreme measures to cool your head off? Then get yourself a Manscaped. Don't be like Ollie and take your scalp from zero to hero with the new scalp buffer now. Use the discount code LOAF to get your 20% off.
Yeah, that's the thing kind of about losing the traditional structure of job, marriage, etc. is that even if you do, and it's not just really about choosing the right path, you know, in one specific time, say at like 22, it's also that you may not have that path until 28 the same way. So it's actually the fact that that choice overload kind of lasts for a lot longer. So I guess my question is, what kind of strategies do you think people should be using or ways of thinking about being lost and having choice overload in order to help deal with that before they do find that path or that way they want to go?
I would say just like give everything a go. And like, you know, you guys started this podcast. Like I love when people start podcasts because I'm like, it's actually a great way to just like figure life out by coming on and like thinking about your life, thinking about ideas, meeting cool people, like whenever you can. Obviously, like my biggest piece of advice is not go and start a podcast, but it did kind of encapsulate in the broader idea of like, just try something and realize that just because you have invested in it to begin with doesn't mean that that's going to be the rest of your life, right? Like I think that's really what scares people with choice overload is they believe that committing to one path means that they're committing for life. And we don't recognize that actually you have so many seasons of life. It's like, if you think about the last 2 years, think about where you were 2 years ago. How much has happened in that time? So much. Like Lucas, you said you graduated. Like now you're in this whole new chapter. Like life is not just this one big chunk of years that spans out in front of you. And once you're locked in on a railroad, like a railway track for your future, like off you go. See you at like Death's Gate, right? Like there's choices within that I think you're still able to make. So I think that's my biggest piece of advice is like just explore. Don't feel locked down to anything. You do have agency to change at any point if you choose to do so.
Maybe to push back slightly on that, what do you think about maybe, for example, situations where you have to decide really big things at, for example, 17, I want to go study medicine. And then after 5 years of studying medicine, you've got this sunk cost, right? You've put so much time and effort into it that to change from there in some sense, it is almost that you've set yourself up for quote unquote life.
Yeah. Well, I get that point, and I also get it's like it's so much money, right? And you're right. It's like the sunk cost of like my family may have spent everything to get me here. This is like a great job. This is a great way to pay them back. But is that the only thing that you can do with that degree? Is that the thing, like, can you not be creative within that? I think it's like, and I will say, like, in a lot of life situations, obviously, like, you're going to have to make hard choices and you will have to give something up. And I think that is a great example of that, Lucas, of like, okay, do I want to give up my future freedom, or do I want to give up these 5 years, give up, you know, I'm saying in quotation marks, like there is always going to be a choice inherent within that. And you really have to like sit back and think about your values, right? Because if the only reason you're going to continue doing something is because you're worried about disappointing someone, or you're worried about the years that you've already given, it's like, well, there are many more years in front of you that you will eventually have to give. And if you know, took a different direction now, in 5 years' time, you'd be like, oh, thank gosh, I did that. And there are many more people that you will disappoint in life. Many. So it's like, okay, get a head start. Like, do it now while it's like when you first like experience dissatisfaction. I think that's a good time to do something. I will say, like, with privilege in mind, obviously, there's a lot to be said about that. And I get pushback sometimes, like saying this stuff and people being like, well, like that's not accounting for low income. But I think it does, because you adjust based on your circumstances and what's available to you in your country, in your job, in your uni, where you are at. Loneliness is like hunger. All it is actually a social cue. I need connection. And all that loneliness is a little alarm bell in your head saying, time to reach out, time to reconnect, time to maybe find new friends.
Jemma Sbeg is someone everyone in their 20s needs.
Point, you say friendship is more important than romantic relationships in your 20s, or can be more important.
If friendships go to the wayside because of a romantic relationship, it can be actually quite detrimental to a person's ability to grow into a well-rounded person. It's like consuming just one media source.
Just try something and realize that just because you have invested in it to begin with doesn't mean that that's going to be the rest of your life.
Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed that short clip of our interview with Jemma Sbeg. If you want to see the full interview, you can click right here. But more importantly, if there's anything you disagree with, please leave a comment. We reply to all comments and we want to hash it out and have a discussion, because everyone learns that way. Make sure to like and subscribe as well. We got loads more content like that coming soon. See you guys next time.